Communication is about sales. Keep it simple. People will fill in the blank with their own, I hate to say biases, but with their own perspective in many cases.
The tobacco companies knew nicotine was an addictive drug, yet they told Congress,
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
you see the same small group of people that the tobacco industry used working on all kinds of other issues.
Dioxins, pesticides, chemicals in general, I mean, there's no evidence that these are harming us.
Scientists will explain the science. Against the scientists, they will have a so-called expert.
7-week-old baby was in a crib.
I literally heard a gasp when he told the story about this baby.
Either one of you paid to testify for your time here in opposition to the bill?
Citizens for Fire Safety.
Citizens for Fire Safety, the 3 largest makers of flame retardants in the world.
Some of these so-called experts turn out to be very, very good at it.
I'm not a scientist, although I do play one on TV occasionally. Okay, hell, more than occasionally.
It creates a whole new cast of characters, these people who become well known for casting doubt on global warming.
Catastrophic global warming is a hoax.
There's no scientific consensus.
You go up against a scientist, most of them are very hard to understand and very boring.
It's all about preventing you from looking where the action really is, which is in the science.
The Earth is getting warmer, no question about it.
Bold-faced lie.
It's kind of an amazing accomplishment. Such a small group of people have had an enormous impact on public opinion.
We're the negative force. We're just trying to stop stuff.
You don't fool me anymore. And the change is gonna come. And we will see the light.
So, Robert, this is not entirely new turf for you. In your film Food Inc., you've previously dealt with various forms of deception by larger organizations, but this one casts a sort of a wider net. So maybe first tell us a little bit about how you came to just the general topic of this kind of deception, and whether it's climate change or the cigarette industry, all these different elements in play.
Actually, when I was first starting on Food Inc., I went to a hearing on whether to label cloned meat. I hadn't realized there was such a thing as cloned meat. And someone from the meat industry stood up and said, I really don't think it's in the interest of consumers to have that kind of information. And I thought, whoa, where does that come from? And I started looking into it, and it was groups like Citizens for Consumer Freedom, who were paid by the soda companies and fast food companies, that will do everything to stop you from knowing what's in your food. So it's this total Orwellian world. And that kind of interested me to think about, who are these people that have a name that says one thing and they do the exact opposite? And that sort of led me into thinking there'd be an interesting, in effect, follow-up to Food Inc.
And there's this really fascinating framing device that you use with this magician, sort of talking about, card tricks as almost an analogy for the deception in play. So tell us a little bit more about, where did this point of comparison come from your perspective?
Well, in the making of this film, we were just so in awe of these deceivers, ultimately it was a small group of people who were able to create doubt around the product of tobacco for 50 years, and they went on to work for multiple other industries. And they've been very successful in creating doubt. And every time we would think about it, we'd say, these guys are like magicians. And if you say it enough, all of a sudden it occurs to you, hey, why don't we work with a magician who starts to, in explaining how he can do his magic, it became the perfect metaphor for what's going on in the world of the deception that we talk about in Merchants of Doubt.
So speaking of that deception in more specific terms, I think if you were to just sort of tell people more generally that, the smoking industry, the tobacco industry, knew that smoking was bad for people for a long period of time, they would say, yes, and I mean, it's not that this is necessarily new information. What, from your perspective, was sort of fresh or revealing about, sort of looking at this process of denial or whatever you want to call it?
Well, there were there was someone who went from tobacco, a guy named Peter Sparber, who basically when tobacco was confronting a slow-burning cigarette, and they thought that would be bad for business. They didn't want the slow-burning cigarette. Peter Sparber went out and convinced people it wasn't cigarettes that caused house fires, it was couches that caused house fires. That takes a lot of talent. And he then was able to help make it a law that we needed to put chemicals in couches that turned out didn't prevent house fires, but caused cancer. And that became a law that we had to do that. That takes a lot of talent. And yet it's also pretty frightening that you can do that. And when I spoke to Peter Sparber and tried to convince him unsuccessfully to be in the film, I said, you're so good at what you do, because he wrote a memo saying, if you can do tobacco, you can do anything. And he went on to do everything, as did all the people in our film, or many of the people in the film, I should say. And Peter, when I told him what our film was about, that it was not only tobacco and not only chemicals and couches, but in pharmaceutical and going on to the big payday of climate, he said, you could take James Hansen, the leading climate scientist, and I could take a garbage man, and I could get America to believe the garbage man knows more about climate science than Hansen does. So I think it's their sort of outright sort of pride in being able to fool people that I was kind of stunned by.
Well, and then it also seems on some level like it's a microcosm of the way that conversations sort of travel in our climate, the way that the media sort of digests information has a direct impact on the way different people think they have the facts,
Well, I think on some levels in our film, one of the things that most upsets me is that these people are able to go on television and represent themselves as scientific experts, and the media allows them to. So we have Mark Morano, who was really a PR person, who, when I asked him what does he do, he said, I play a scientist on television. And I'm going, oh my, this kind of shocks me when people actually will say that to you. Or James Taylor, who's from the Heartland Institute, said, I took a science class or two in college. I think that makes me pretty much an expert. That was part of the shocking information that we were receiving. But the problem is the press is then representing these people as experts and putting them on television, and it's confusing the public. So I think that's starting to change. The New York Times is now doing excellent work, but for a long time, they were helping to be part of the fact that saying this is a debate when it wasn't a debate. What's going on, and whether it was about tobacco or pharmaceutical, all these different industries, we have people who are pseudo-experts who are really working undercover to help create doubt, like the tobacco people did. I think what's interesting about the tobacco is it's such a great, obvious example that we all know about, but that playbook is being used for everything else almost in an identical manner, and that's the shocking part.
Well, and also one of the things that the movie taps into is the way in which political sensibilities tend to inform the kind of bias that someone has, irrespective of what the facts say. And there's this really interesting moment where you have this this character who's the editor of Skeptic magazine, used to be a climate change denier, and then he changed his mind, and he goes to this a libertarian conference where he says something like 99% of scientists say that climate change is real, and some guy says that's a lie, and it just seems sort of like that kind of anger, which defies reason, is sort of at the heart of what this film is tussling with. And I wonder, when you're working on it, was it frustrating for you to run into these sort of situations? Did you want to argue with these people more?
Well, actually, the man that was screaming, "You're a liar," I bumped into him in the hallway, and he was saying about the person who was debating Michael Shermer from Skeptic, and he was saying, "I don't know how he keeps his cool." I would be so upset. I think that on some levels, facts don't matter. That people want to go with their tribe, but tribes change, and I really think that as a way the Republicans in the House and the Congress have been pretty unanimous in saying that man doesn't cause climate change. But I think their voters are starting to question that. There was just a poll in the New York Times, 48% of Republicans say we should have regulations to help change what's happening. So despite the Koch's money, who are putting up a lot of money to make us still not believe what's happening, I think people are starting to see the lie, see the deception, and we can start the real debate. What do we do about it?
So who didn't want to talk to you? Because not everybody is as forthcoming about these matters.
Yeah. I wanted to talk with Steve Malloy, who's been who's worked for tobacco, he's worked for every industry there is. He was in our film. There's a moment where he's on Glenn Beck, and Glenn Beck said, "Are you in bed with Big Oil? And if so, how good in bed are they?" And Steve said, no, I'm just trying to do the right thing. Well, again, that's sort of part of the act here, is to pretend you're an independent agent. Steve was not an independent agent. He was being paid by coal companies. He's being paid by energy companies to go out and confuse people. And there are a number of those people who are on television professing to be independent and trying to study the facts when they're being paid major amounts of money to confuse people. And Steve ultimately, Steve said he was going to be in the film. We talked for months, and we flew to Washington from Los Angeles, and he canceled that morning. Tim Phillips from Americans for Prosperity is in the film, though he canceled on me again in Washington when I went to see him a second time. And Peter Sparber, the man who was able to put the chemicals in the couches, when I told him, "You're so good at what you do, I'd love to have you in the film," and when he told me the story that he could get the garbage man, America to believe the garbage man, I said, "I'd love to have you in the film because of your talent." And he said, "You can make a great film without me, and I can live a great life without you." So he said, "Let's talk tomorrow," but he never called me back. So there were a number of declines, but I was happy with the people who did talk, and someone like Mark Morano who talked was actually a very honest, straightforward, and really insightful person to learn about why he takes pride in doing what he does, and helped. I thought he was pretty straight in explaining what kind of actions deniers need to take, such as he said, all we need to do is create the status quo, keep the status quo, and then we're successful, which was interesting.
Interesting in a lot of ways. So in terms of the way in which this film could correct some of the conversation going on surrounding these things, how do you see it doing that? I mean, it's certainly not the first to deal with each of the topics sort of that it takes on, whether it's climate change, we had an inconvenient truth, or the smoking situation and so forth. I mean, many of these topics have been dealt with through different forms of activism. So in what sense do you see this film as sort of tackling it in a more, let's say, productive means?
I think one of the most important things is for the media to label the people who are going on television in a correct manner. And I'm hoping we can help networks and newspapers look at what I'd call a false debate. When people are being paid by tobacco companies or oil companies, they should not be listed as independent agents if that's how they're making their living, and are there just to create confusion, as opposed to a scientist who's there talking about what his research is yielding. I think that's the biggest thing, and I'm encouraged because the BBC is saying they're no longer allowing deniers to talk about the science. Washington Post does not want editorials anymore, and I think that's the trend. The New York Times has been great. They just wrote the article about Willie Soon, who's one of the few, there's a handful of scientists who say climate change is not caused by man. And it turned out Willie Soon was being paid over $1 million by oil companies, and he was referring to his scientific research as deliverables for the oil company. And that's one of the few scientists out there, and the Times is finally calling them out for what they are.
So do you see this movie as deserving of a sequel? I mean, are there more targets you haven't taken on yet in terms of the way that this phenomenon takes place?
You know, in a strange way, after making Food Inc., everyone said, are you going to make a food sequel? In some ways, I kind of think of this as the sequel to Food Inc. And, you know, movies come to you in strange ways. You never know where you're going. Maybe it'll be a comedy next time.
And before we go to questions from the audience, one other issue I wanted to bring up is, you know, this is not a movie that is necessarily anti-corporation. Worth pointing out, when you're sitting in an AOL building and live streaming on AOL.com, what do you think you know, larger corporate entities can do to sort of deal with the dangers that this film, you know, grapples with?
I think that's a great question, and I think that it's really important that this is not an anti-corporate film, though it's certainly pointing out some terrible corporate behavior. And in my going around with this film, I spoke with Secretary of State, former Secretary of State George Shultz, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, and you know, he was saying, hey, business can be the solution to this problem, but we need real transparency. We need to sort of reflect the externalities, what things really cost. When people throw garbage in the air, they should be paying a price for that garbage. Until we're starting to do that, the system won't work. And this is Reagan's Secretary of State, who, by the way, said his most proud moment was putting through the ozone treaty, and it was one of Reagan's most proud moments. And the guys in our film thought that was a terrible thing to have done and sort of came out and attacked them and said that it turns out they were right, but they did it prematurely and they shouldn't have acted. So even Ronald Reagan is suspect. But I do think corporations actually can play the role to help fix the problem. Like ALEC is a collection of different corporations, and they're putting through a new bill I just heard about, which is called the Electric Freedom Act, which is an attempt to make it illegal to rent solar panels. Hopefully, corporations will drop out of ALEC and speak out and say that's unacceptable behavior. I know the reinsurance business is saying, hey, they can't stay in business if we still have climate change, because we have to really have a real reflection, and it's all going to go on the taxpayer. So there are going to be tremendous costs to business and to all of us if we can't start to pay the real costs. So hopefully business will make it so we start to look at what those costs are and make them realistic and deal with it.
All right, so let's take some questions from the audience. I believe there's a microphone.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for making not only this, but Food Inc. I love Food Inc. so much, so very much. But my question really comes down to, like, with the isolated or the incidences that you kind of discussed with both Merchants of Doubt and Food Inc. Were you noticing that they're isolated mostly to just the United States? That these, I mean, that you're seeing the ignorance is pretty much just here in the U.S. as opposed to other countries? You know, yeah.
Good question. I think that with the food world, so much of what we have is being transported all over the world, and it's the same thing with Merchants of Doubt. You know, in a way, they both reflect each other, and there's total similarities. So I think it's become an international situation. But what's interesting is, you know, one of the things the deniers say about climate is we shouldn't go ahead because the rest of the world's not going to act. But now China said they're going to act. India looks like they're going to act. So really, we're kind of one of the last ones to move ahead. But you know, with food, we're certainly the ones who exported all this fast food. But the rest of the world is certainly following suit pretty quickly.
Other questions?
Oh yeah. Why do you think that someone like Mark Morano is so willing to pull back the curtain and reveal what he does to you? Does he not realize that he's outing himself, or ruining his career somehow?
Well, I don't know if Mark was ruining his career. Maybe he was helping his career. I can't speak to that. He knew I had made Food Inc. We talked about it. Like at one point I said to Mark, "You're so much thinner today than you were in some of your old clips." And he told me that was because he's on the denier diet. And he unfortunately couldn't share it with me since I didn't see the world like he did. So he knew we have different points of view. I think on some levels I was going to be respectful of Mark and present him as he would want to have himself presented. Hopefully Mark will see the film, I think it's Wednesday night. I hope he likes it. I think he will like it. How much this hurts or helps him, I can't answer, but I don't think he did it because he thought it might hurt him.
Hi. With so many media companies, businesses, and politicians either outwardly or allegedly being associated with each other, do you see significant change happening anytime soon, or this being a long-term process in the U.S.?
With the media company? I'm sorry, I didn't quite...
Sorry, I'm saying with the media and the politicians and businesses being so closely linked together, do you see significant change happening anytime soon, or would this be a long-term process for us?
You know, I hope on some levels that, you know, for business, when I spoke with an admiral in the Navy, he's saying this is going to be the greatest danger facing the United States today is climate change. Or if you talk to reinsurance, they're saying this is going to be the most costly problem. So these are... You know, this is a challenge, and I don't only mean climate. I'm talking about ultimately transparency in business, that it's going to be good for business if we have that transparency. And, you know, people say, can we solve these problems? Do we have to change the capitalist system? I think this is the greatest system, you know, on earth, but you need it to be real and transparent and honest, and hopefully we can make it more of that in the future, and it could change and be very profitable for all of us if that's what happens.
Any other questions?
We can throw it back to you guys if there's no more questions.
I would say the question I would have just to pivot off of that is, you know, whereas Mark Moran may not have seen the film yet, certainly other people who have different reactions to it have. I mean, while it's opening this week, it first emerged on the film festival circuit last fall. So what sort of life has the movie had so far since you've finished it in terms of reactions and so forth?
Well, we've had a few reviews. You know, they'll really be coming in this week, and we open. So I'm expecting it to be a lot more reactions coming up in the very near future. But the few reviews, some of them called Mark, said that he, you know, was a total sociopath, and Mark called and said, "What'd you say about me?" And I said, "I really didn't say anything," though I thought the person writing the article was saying more than I was saying about Mark. He was coming up and making his own statements. People can respond to Mark in whatever way they want. I tried to let the viewer decide what they think of him. And as a filmmaker, it's a tricky balance because you want to represent people fairly, and Mark's hard not to kind of enjoy being with when you're with him. At the same time, there are consequences to his action, and certainly the consequences to those scientists whose lives were totally changed by Mark talking about them. And I wanted to show that side, you know, and the effect that Mark has on people as well as his charm.
Well, and it's an interesting point as well because the balance between filmmaking and journalism is one that this movie brings to the forefront of your argument. I mean, you're not, you know, Michael Moore style in front of the camera running around punking people, you know, but there is some element of, you know, you clearly have some kind of an agenda here, and using that magician analogy, I think, sets it up quite succinctly. So that must have been a sort of an interesting challenge for you to dance around.
It was a real challenge on this film because I really like to be close and develop a relationship with my characters. I'm not out to get you. At the same time, I do have a point of view, and I've tried not to fool anybody. Fred Singer, who is sort of an ideological denier who thinks of people as being environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. Fred approached me and said, I'm doing a book about food called How Plastics and Pesticides Will Save the World. Would I like to co-author it with him? And I said, I kind of see the world a little differently than you do, Fred. You know, we have very different points of view. So I wanted to present the fact that I'm not here to agree with them, but I was there to try to understand their point of view. But it is tricky because you enjoy people. Mark Morano showed up when he said he was going to show up. He answered questions in a very forthright manner. So on one hand, I'm appreciative, but on the other hand, I don't want to get sort of lost in my appreciation and not show the effect of what I think Mark's doing. It's a tricky balance.
Do we have any other questions here that are hiding away? I also want to bring up Food Inc. again because it's been a number of years since that film came out, and now it seems to enjoy a relatively healthy life on Netflix, and people are very aware of that. How did this sort of success of that movie and the sort of popularity of its message inform the kind of expectations that you had as a filmmaker with, like I said before, a certain agenda to push, a certain kind of, sensibility that you wanted to advocate for, not just, telling a story?
Well, in a way, again, Food Inc., like Merchants of Doubt, was really, well, Food Inc. wasn't really just about food. It was about, if you have a product, shouldn't you, if you live in America, advertise and be proud of the product, not try to hide the product. So again, that's where I think the parallels exist in Merchants that existed with Food Inc., and I was kind of shocked by that. But I was also shocked by the response because people were really moved across political spectrums. Ultimately, everyone cares about what goes in their stomach, and people were upset that they were being deceived, and hopefully people will be upset in the same way by this film, how they're being perceived, and I hope that half as much action is taken on this film as happened on Food Inc. I was as a filmmaker derailed by Food Inc. Because I was just constantly being asked to go talk about food, and I'd always made a film once a year, and all of a sudden I took 2-3 years before I made my next film, which was interesting to all of a sudden become an advocate as opposed to just a filmmaker.
And just to go back to that magician again, who is he? And tell us a little bit about how you decided to bring him into the story.
I love it. It's Jamie Ian Swiss is the magician's name, and he was the great metaphor for this film. And Jamie is part of the Skeptic Society, which Michael Shermer is part of as well. And so he thinks about these issues, but what was so great about Jamie is he never overstepped his bounds when he's talking about the psychology of how you fool people in magic. How, one of the things he says is, once you see a trick, you'll never unsee it. Once revealed, never concealed. And I thought of that perhaps as the metaphor for this film, that hopefully when people understand how the playbook works, and that the same things that we all knew about tobacco, that it's bad for you and how they created confusion, which we all know. But what the joke of that is, those same people use the same exact tactics on new products, and it keeps working. But hopefully, if one understands how the playbook works, you'll think of the tactics in a different way in the future.
And you'll never see a card trick the same way again.
Jamie's card tricks, by the way, are the greatest, and we've looked at them 200-300 times and cannot imagine how they're done. And I think it adds a great element to the movie itself, just watching this incredible magic, and he's awesome.
So Mike Moran isn't the only person who gets to see the movie this week. It opens
The film opens March 6th in New York and Los Angeles, and then March 13th in Washington, Chicago, and San Francisco, and then March 20th it rolls out after that. But if you go to the Sony website, Merchants of Doubt on the Sony site, you'll get all the dates and trailers and magazine articles. So.
And how can people keep track of sort of not just that, but the life of the movie and the way that the message sort of continues to travel?
TakePart.com/doubt or TakePart/doubt, and that will. There's some extra bonus videos that are going to be out there, and they're going to be sort of different programs that they're helping to run about journalism and transparency, and hopefully people can go there and become part of that. And there's also Forecast the Facts is doing a program with Take Part to sort of demand this transparency for, that not listing science or these PR guys who call themselves skeptics. They're saying they should be called deniers. They're not scientific skeptics. So that's on Forecast the Facts and TakePart.com.
Great, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, everybody.